Have you ever wondered why there is only one human species left on Earth today? Wherever you go, every person you meet belongs to the same species, Homo sapiens. But tens of thousands of years ago, the world looked very different. Our planet was almost like a fantasy world, with several different kinds of humans living at the same time and sharing the same resources. At one point in the distant past, as many as 8 or 9 human species existed on Earth, when humans had neighbors. Imagine something like the Lord of the Rings brought to life, a world where tiny humans and much larger humans could walk across the same continent. But these were not apes. They were real human species, each with its own brain, body, and abilities. They all belonged to the genus Homo and were closely related to us in evolutionary terms. Different species made their homes in very different places, from freezing caves to remote tropical islands. So who were these ancient neighbors, and where did they live? Meet some of the most remarkable members of the human family. There were the powerfully built Neanderthals of Europe, the mysterious Denisovans of Asia, and several tiny human species living on isolated islands. And here's what makes their story even more impressive. They were not brief experiments in evolution. Many of them survived successfully for hundreds of thousands of years before eventually disappearing. First, there were the Neanderthals, incredibly strong hunters who were remarkably well adapted to the bitter cold of Europe. Their bodies were far more muscular and heavily built than ours. To survive in freezing environments, they evolved large noses that helped warm cold air before it entered the lungs, along with short, stocky bodies that reduced heat loss. Those adaptations worked extremely well. Neanderthals lived across Europe and Western Asia for more than 300,000 years before our ancestors arrived. The mountain mystery people. Then there were the Denisovans, one of the most mysterious human groups ever discovered. They lived across parts of cold, high-altitude Asia and were so well adapted to life at elevation that our ancestors later inherited Denisovan genetic variants that helped humans survive in the thin air of the Tibetan Plateau. But here's the strange part. Scientists first identified the Denisovans from little more than a fragment of a finger bone and several teeth found inside a cave in Siberia. Their teeth were unusually large, and their biology included adaptations connected to surviving in low-oxygen environments. Asia was also home to Homo erectus, a human species with long legs and an extraordinarily durable body. They were among the first great explorers in human history, leaving Africa and spreading into distant parts of the world. Homo erectus stood roughly as tall as modern humans, and their strong legs were well suited for traveling long distances on foot. Even more remarkable, they were one of the longest-lasting human species ever known, surviving for nearly 2 million years. But if you imagine ancient humans as universally tall and powerful, Homo floresiensis changes the picture completely. These were real-life tiny humans, standing only about 1 meter tall and weighing roughly half as much as a modern elementary school child. They lived in isolation on the Indonesian island of Flores. Their unusual size eventually earned them a famous and surprisingly fitting nickname among scientists and the public, the hobbits. And not far from the home of the hobbits, another small-bodied human species appeared, Homo luzonensis. They lived on the island of Luzon in the Philippines and seemed to have retained unusual adaptations for climbing. Their finger and toe bones were curved, resembling traits seen in much older ape-like ancestors and suggesting that climbing remained an important part of their lives. But here's where it gets interesting. Despite those extremely ancient-looking features, their teeth were small and surprisingly similar in several ways to those of modern humans. Elsewhere in Africa, Homo naledi left behind an even stranger mystery. Their remains are closely associated with the deep, dark rising star cave system in South Africa. Homo naledi had a brain only about the size of an orange, yet the rest of their anatomy was a fascinating mixture of ancient and surprisingly modern traits. Their curved fingers were well suited for climbing, while their feet were shaped for upright walking much like our own. And that's still not the whole story. Hidden inside our own bodies today are traces of even more mysterious ancient humans population scientists sometimes call ghost lineages. They are called ghosts because no fossil remains have yet been securely identified as belonging to them. Instead, scientists discovered evidence of their existence through unusual stretches of DNA preserved in the genomes of living people. Those genetic traces suggest that at least two extremely ancient human populations once encountered our ancestors and passed some of their DNA into the human family. Then, everyone disappeared. Every one of these human species was capable, intelligent, and equipped with its own set of survival skills. But then something strange happened. Around 40,000 years ago, many of them began disappearing. Fossil evidence of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and other ancient humans gradually vanishes from the archaeological record. In the end, only one human species remained: Homo sapiens. We survived, spread across the planet, and eventually became the only humans left on Earth. For a long time, people thought the explanation was simple. Homo sapiens survived because we were smarter, while the other human species simply could not compete. It sounds reasonable, but more recent archaeological discoveries have made that explanation much harder to defend. Ancient humans were not the slow, primitive creatures they are sometimes portrayed as. They were capable populations with sophisticated behavior, practical intelligence, and remarkably effective survival skills. The first surprise is hidden inside the Neanderthal skull. Their brains were actually larger than those of modern humans. On average, Neanderthal brains were roughly 10 to 20% larger than ours. A significant amount of that brain capacity was associated with vision and spatial processing that may have helped them function effectively in low-light environments and remember complex landscapes as they traveled across enormous territories. And their intelligence was not just a matter of brain size. Neanderthals were also skilled cooks and surprisingly creative people. They knew how to use fire to cook food, making nutrients easier for the body to absorb. Archaeologists have also discovered colored shells and mineral pigments in Neanderthal sites that may have been used for personal decoration. In other words, they made ornaments and may even have used pigments to decorate their bodies. But perhaps the most surprising evidence comes from the way they treated one another. Neanderthals cared for injured people, elderly members of their groups, and individuals who could no longer hunt for themselves. They also appear to have deliberately buried some of their dead. In certain graves, bodies were carefully positioned, sometimes alongside objects or traces that researchers have interpreted as possibly connected to burial practices. Whatever the exact meaning of those burials, one thing is clear: Neanderthals formed strong social bonds and looked after members of their communities. Neanderthals and our Homo sapiens ancestors were not always enemies, either. In the region that is now Israel, the two human groups lived in the same broader landscape for long periods of time. They may have exchanged stone tool technologies and learned behaviors from one another. Over time, some aspects of their material culture became increasingly similar. So their relationship was not simply a story of competition. It also involved contact, interaction, and cultural exchange. So if Neanderthals were intelligent, powerful, and capable of cooperation, why did they disappear? Part of the answer may have been built into their own muscular bodies. Strength came with a cost. Large muscles require a great deal of energy, creating what was essentially a dangerous energy trap. When food was plentiful, that high energy demand was manageable. But when food became scarce, the same powerful body that had once been an advantage could suddenly become a serious burden. The price of being strong. A Neanderthal, living under demanding conditions, may have needed around 5,000 calories a day to maintain that powerful body. That could be roughly twice the energy requirement of a modern adult. Meeting those needs meant regularly hunting large animals for calorie-rich meat and fat. But hunting big game was never guaranteed to succeed. A few unsuccessful days could quickly put an entire group under enormous nutritional pressure. Homo sapiens, meanwhile, had a very different advantage. Our bodies were generally lighter, slimmer, and less expensive to maintain. If a Neanderthal body was like a powerful truck that burned through fuel, Homo sapiens was closer to a more efficient vehicle. A lighter build meant we could survive on less energy. And when food became scarce for long periods, that difference could become extremely important. Then the environment began making survival even harder. The Earth was going through repeated episodes of severe climate change, including sudden periods of intense cold. Forests shrank, landscapes transformed rapidly, and once productive grasslands could become harsh, frozen environments. Many of the large animals Neanderthals depended on either migrated away or declined in number. And as those food sources became less reliable, the energy demands of the Neanderthal body became more dangerous than ever. Maintaining such powerful bodies required a tremendous amount of food, and that made it difficult for Neanderthals to gather in large communities. Instead, they often lived in small family groups scattered across enormous territories, with relatively little contact between them. At certain points, the entire Neanderthal population of Europe may have been no larger than the population of a small town today. And when those groups became too isolated, a serious problem emerged. Finding a mate who was not a close relative became increasingly difficult. That long-term isolation came with a dangerous biological consequence: inbreeding. When populations are small and rarely mix with outsiders, fresh genetic diversity becomes harder to maintain. Over many generations, harmful genetic variants can begin to accumulate. Scientists have found signs of congenital abnormalities in some late Neanderthal remains that may be associated with inbreeding. And in a population already so small, it would not have taken much to cause trouble. Even a modest decline in the number of young women successfully having children could have pushed the population closer to extinction. But while Neanderthal groups were becoming smaller and more isolated, Homo sapiens had a very different kind of advantage: enormous social networks. We did not limit our relationships to the people in our immediate families. We formed connections with other groups across wide territories, creating networks of friends and allies that could even include people we had never personally met. When one region suffered from disaster or food shortages, those connections could work almost like an insurance system, allowing groups to share resources and help one another survive. Those wider connections also allowed Homo sapiens to establish long-distance exchange networks surprisingly early. Our ancestors traded valuable stones, pigments, and other materials across distances of many tens of kilometers. In Africa, by around 320,000 years ago, people were obtaining rare volcanic obsidian from distant sources. But here's the important part. Materials were not the only things moving between groups. Every encounter created an opportunity for a new idea, a new technique, or a better survival strategy to spread from one community to another. And once ideas could travel, even small inventions could have enormous consequences. One of them was the bone-sewing needle. It does not look revolutionary, but it allowed Homo sapiens to stitch pieces of animal hide together into clothing that fit more closely, blocked the wind, and trapped heat more effectively. In freezing conditions, that mattered enormously, especially for infants. Warm, tightly fitted clothing could help a baby retain body heat and improve its chances of surviving a brutal winter. Neanderthals also used animal hides for clothing, but their garments may have been simpler and less tightly fitted than those made by Homo sapiens. Draped hides could still leave openings where freezing air could get inside and body heat could escape. They appear to have lacked the fine sewing needles that made it possible to stitch smaller pieces of hide into more complete garments. It seems like a tiny technological difference, but in a world of falling temperatures and bitter winds, it could have made a major difference in staying warm. Then there was another Homo sapiens advantage: ranged weapons. We developed tools that allowed hunters to strike prey from farther away, including spear throwers and, later, bows and arrows. A spear thrower effectively extends the length of the arm, allowing a projectile to travel farther and hit with greater force. That meant a hunter did not always have to stand right beside an enormous animal to bring it down. When dealing with dangerous prey, a few dozen meters of distance could mean the difference between dinner and a serious injury. Neanderthals, by contrast, often hunted with heavy wooden spears used at close range. That meant getting dangerously near large animals such as bison and driving the weapon directly into the prey. Just imagine standing in front of a massive bison as it charges toward you. The danger becomes obvious immediately. Neanderthal shoulder anatomy also appears to have been less suited than ours for powerful long-distance throwing. Their skeletons frequently show evidence of serious injuries and broken bones, suggesting that close-range hunting came at a very high physical cost. But perhaps the most remarkable Homo sapiens advantage had nothing to do with weapons or clothing. It may have come from the way we learned to live with one another. One hypothesis proposes that our species went through a process known as self-domestication. Over many generations, individuals who were extremely aggressive and difficult to cooperate with may have had fewer social advantages, while people who could share, cooperate, and live peacefully within larger communities were more successful. Gradually, Homo sapiens may have become less reactive and better at cooperation, communication, and empathy. And self-domestication may have changed more than our behavior. It may also have helped reshape our faces. Over time, Homo sapiens developed shorter faces, reduced brow ridges, and one particularly unusual feature: a clearly projecting chin. Homo sapiens is the only known human species with a true prominent chin like ours. Neanderthals and Homo erectus did not have one. Their lower jaws followed a much straighter profile. But that raises a strange question. How could becoming more socially tolerant possibly change the shape of the human face? That's where the story gets even more interesting. Ever wonder why something as simple as a chin might have anything to do with being less aggressive? One possible answer lies in what scientists call domestication syndrome, a collection of traits sometimes seen in domesticated animals, such as the floppy ears of certain dogs. When calmer, more tolerant individuals are favored over many generations, changes in hormones and development can also affect the shape of the face. The result may be a more youthful, less aggressive appearance, one that makes eye contact and emotional expression easier between members of Homo sapiens, the alliance that changed everything. That greater tolerance and ability to cooperate may also have opened the door to one of the most important partnerships in human history: dogs. Homo sapiens became the only human species known to domesticate wolves and form a lasting alliance with them. Early dogs could help track prey by scent, warn people of danger, and protect camps from predators. Once humans and dogs began hunting together, the partnership offered a major advantage. One side brought intelligence and weapons. The other brought speed, hearing, and an extraordinary sense of smell. Neanderthals, meanwhile, had no such four-legged partners beside them. They had to handle every stage of the hunt themselves, from tracking and chasing prey to finally bringing it down. In snowstorms, simply following an animal's trail could require a huge amount of energy. Without dogs to help, every hunt could become more physically demanding. And as food grew harder to find, the absence of that extra hunting partner may have made competition even more difficult. But that's still only part of the story. When Homo sapiens left Africa, we may also have carried something far less visible with us: pathogens. Our ancestors had lived alongside many kinds of bacteria and viruses for long periods of time, giving their immune systems some degree of adaptation. When they came into contact with other ancient human populations, some of those diseases may have crossed between groups. Neanderthals, who had never encountered certain pathogens, could have been especially vulnerable, placing even more pressure on populations that were already small. Still, the disappearance of ancient human species was not simply the story of one group violently wiping out another. Part of what happened was something very different. Their populations mixed. Homo sapiens met, lived alongside, and had children with both Neanderthals and Denisovans. That means these ancient humans never vanished completely. Some of their DNA entered our ancestors and continued traveling through generation after generation. Today, most people with ancestry outside Africa carry roughly 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA. It is one of the clearest signs that Neanderthals still left something behind in us. Genetic material from people who once hunted across the frozen landscapes of Europe now survives inside billions of humans. Even some traits involving our skin, hair, or immune system may still be influenced by ancient Neanderthal genes. In Asia and Oceania, the story includes another ancient relative, the Denisovans. Some modern populations carry roughly 0.1 to 5% Denisovan DNA, and those inherited genes are not just historical souvenirs. Some have real biological effects. Certain Denisovan genetic variants help people living on the Tibetan Plateau cope with low oxygen at high altitude, while others are associated with immune responses that may have helped modern humans deal with particular pathogens. And even Neanderthals and Denisovans are not the whole story. Modern human DNA also contains signs that may have come from mysterious ancient populations in Africa, so-called ghost lineages for which we still lack clearly identified fossils. Some genetic studies suggest that Homo sapiens ancestors interbred with human populations that had split from our lineage far deeper in the past. In that sense, our genome is not the record of a single straight line. It is a mosaic shaped by many encounters between different human populations. So Earth went from being a planet shared by several kinds of humans to one where only Homo sapiens remains. But our survival cannot be reduced to the idea that we were simply stronger or smarter than everyone else. Our lighter, more energy-efficient bodies helped us survive periods of food shortage. Our wider social networks allowed resources and ideas to move between communities. And our ability to cooperate, communicate, and maintain relationships helped connect small groups into something far larger. And now, when we look up at the night sky and wonder whether humanity is alone in the universe, it is worth remembering that here on Earth, we once were not alone at all. Neanderthals, Denisovans, and other ancient humans lived alongside our ancestors. They never disappeared completely because part of their story is still being carried inside human DNA today. The story of Homo sapiens, then, is not only a story of survival. It is also a story of connection, mixing, understanding, and cooperation, the very qualities that may help us face whatever comes next.